Okay, so Be'ezras Hashem, we are in Hakdamus Sha'arim from the Leshem Shvei V'Chaloima, Shaar Beis, Parak Beis, and hopefully tonight we'll finish Parak Beis, and that will be the completion of Shaar Beis, and we'll be able to start with Shaar Gimel next week, Be'ezras Hashem, but we'll see. So, picking up from where we left off in the very simple but complex relationship between the Chomer of the Elyon, which becomes the Tzura of the Tachton, and it's not only the Tzura of the Tachton, but rather it contains the germ cell of the Chomer of the Tachton as well, so that the Tzura and the Chomer of the Tachton emerge from within the Chomer of the Elyon, and that's where we're picking up. And it's the process of the first expression, which is the preparation from the upper world to create space for a lower world, and then the ascent back up, which is the second stage, which is the first removal, which leaves back the residual thickness that remained. And then it's the second entrance, the second hispashtus, which is like the upper world re-entering down into the governing principle of the lower world, reanimating kind of the chomer of that lower world to operate like the kav. So it's the descent downwards to create the space, the ascent upwards to ensure that that space can develop independently, but there were certain residual elements of that previous dependence that remained. Then it's a re-entrance of the upper world back in, but at this point it's not situated there presently at every moment, but it's just kind of interacting, engaging, and illuminating. And the Ikar Tachlis is ultimately to create the Chomer of the lower world, which then becomes the Tzura of the world below it, because we're going to see that the end result is ultimately the first in thought here. The whole Tachlis is the final product, which is the Chomer of the Elyon, which is the Chomer of the Tachton. V'hinei. And now, Hagam shenaspar min divreinu sha'chomer v'hatzura hem echad me'sharasham. So we've already explained to you that when we speak of the emergence of the Chomer of the upper world, which is like the Malchus of the upper world, becoming the Tzura of the lower world, becoming the Keser of the lower world, so we've explained that we're not only talking about the Tzura of the lower world, which are the general principles, but rather we're also talking about the Chomer, the particulars of that lower world, that they emerge as well, singular and unified from the Chomer of the Elyon. V'chein heim miyuchadim ze b'zeh tamid. Not only do they both emerge from the same place, which is the Chomer of the Elyon, but rather the Tzura and the Chomer of the Tachton, which emerge from the Chomer of the Elyon, are unified perpetually. Im kol zeh hine yesh chiluk gadol beinehem. Nevertheless, once we've described the similarity and sameness, so now we'll describe the difference between the Chomer and the Tzura of the lower world. Ki hine ha-chomer ka'asher shenishlam havyaso u'mitziyuso b'makomo hine hu nivdal me'ha'olam ha'elyon legamre v'loi nira b'oid kesher v'shaychas imo klal ki oimid kol mitziyuso rak lamata. When it comes to the Chomer of the lower world, which at this point is theoretically 2 steps removed from the Chomer of the upper world, because the Chomer of the upper world first and foremost gives birth to the Tzura of the lower world, which is 1 step removed, and then the Chomer of the lower world emerges out of the Tzura of the lower world, so now it's almost kilu 2 steps removed. And at this stage, because it's 2 steps removed, because it's a ha'ara de ha'ara, so to speak, an illumination of an illumination rather than just an illumination, or it's like koach kocho that Chazal discussed in the first parak of Baba Kama. Chazal are already operating with the questions of influence that are separated in stages and gradations. So it's very much a lumdus over here. So the Chomer of the lower world is already removed in its entirety. Once it's taken on a real formation that's rooted in the thickened light from the previous expression, so at that point it's completely removed from the world above it, and there is velo nira bo od kesher v'shaychas imo klal. So over here this word is obviously highly interpretive, because nira means it appears that way, right? So we're speaking on the level of appearance, not ontology here. Obviously the upper world continues to have an unlimited and unmitigated relationship with the lower world on every level, in a milvado ksiv, right? Hine makom iti, but we're talking about the revealed level here. Lo nira bo od kesher v'shaychas imo. There's no apparent relationship between the upper world, which is really the Chomer of the upper world, but be'erech in relationship to the lower world, that's the infinite light, so to speak. It appears to be no connection, ki oimid kol mitziyus rak lamata, because the entire existence of the Chomer of the Tachton now stands in isolation below. Masha'en kein hatzura, which is not the case when it comes to the Tzura of the lower world, which are simply the general principles of the lower world. Hine hi eina yeredes lamata lisyachid b'hachomer elarak beketza hatachton shelo levad. So now we're speaking of the relationship in which the Chomer of the lower world emerges out of the Tzura of the lower world. Now we're both talking in the principles of the lower world, but here we're talking about the emergence of the Chomer from within the Tzura, and that which really expresses itself in the Chomer of the Tachton is only the lowest part of the Tzura of the Tachton. Meaning the Tzura, we can say, is 10 Sfiros, and the lowest of those Sfiros is Malchus, which is Atzilus, right? So then it's only Malchus to Atzilus that goes down into the worlds of separation to allow that Chomer to be developed. So there's still a connection, but there's a deep divide between the two of them as well. The Tzura, it doesn't descend downwards to unify with the Chomer of the Tachton. Again, the Tzura Tachton here we're talking about. Only the lowest point, only the lowest part of the Tzura of the Tachton extends itself down into the Chomer of the Tachton. Because at the lowest part of the Tzura of the Tachton is where the potential of the Chomer of the Tachton exists, right? Malchus is Leis L'Magram Klum. That's the point of impregnation. That's the place where its potential that is emergent, and therefore we have to engage with the source of things because that's where it comes from. So it's only the lowest rung of the Tzura of the Tachton that extends itself downwards into the Chomer of the Tachton. Why? Because the lowest part of the Tzura of the Tachton is the Shairesh, is the source of the Chomer which is going to emerge from it. Umisham, from the lowest part of the Tzura of the Tachton, Nimshach lo kol chiyusa v'kiyuma v'kol tahaluchas v'anhagasav. And the Chomer of the Tachton draws and sources all of its sustenance, its existence, its process, and its engagements. It draws it all from the lower part of the Tzura of the Tachton, meaning the Tzura of that world. And therefore, because that lowest part of the Tzura is going to be related to and the source of the Chomer, so that lower part of the Tzura is always going to maintain a connection with the Chomer for the entirety of its existence. Aval ikra de hatzura hi la'olam kasher v'davik b'shayrasha shalamala asher ba'olam ha'elyon shehu misibas gimel tamim asher kulam olam l'makam echad. But the first 9 Siros kavyachol of the Tzura of the Tachton, which is what emerged from the Chomer of the Elyon, that is the light that returns back upwards. Right? Basically, the lower part of the Tzura is the thickened light that remains down and remains ever connected to the Chomer of the Tachton. Each level, we're going to see the same halachos. But the rest of the Tzura of the Tachton is still really rooted in the source from which it came, which was the Chomer of the Elyon. Right? It comes down from the higher world, but then it retreats back upwards immediately. And we're going to see why that is. So we see a distinction in the relationship between the Tzura and the Chomer of the Olam HaTachton with the Chomer HaElyon, which is the source. The Chomer is disconnected from the Tzura, except for the last rung of the Tzura in its own world. Masha'en Kain, the Tzura is really, other than its lowest part, deeply connected to the Chomer of the upper world. Yeah? So Leshem says there's going to be 3 reasons. 3 reasons for this distinction, or primarily 3 reasons for why the Tzura of the lower world is really going to remain ever connected to the Chomer of the higher world. Tam Alephu. And like the Leshem always does, there's 3 reasons that are MS1. Tam Aleph, what's the first reason that the Tzura of the lower world remains ever connected to the source of the Chomer of the upper world? Ki hinei efshar l'shum mitzias l'eskayim afilu rega achas behayosim mufred mesheresh sur mechavsa. It is impossible, it is axiomatic for us to understand that in the laws of holiness and the laws of how things operate, of yichud, it is impossible for any existence to survive or sustain itself for even a minimal amount of time in pure separation from its source, which is the stone from which it was hewn, right? The place from which it emerged. Everything remains perpetually connected to, at every moment, the source from which it came. As we're going to explain in the next 2 reasons. For this reason, the Tzura, the upper part of the Tzura HaTachton, which draws its strength, the Tzura, asher hi ikr chiyusa da chomer, which we're going to see is the essential life of the Chomer HaTachton. Like we said, the lowest part of the Tzura enlivens the Chomer HaTachton. The koyach havyosa v'kiyumo. Huchrach lihishayr lamala leishev b'seiser elyon tamid. The Tzura needed, even though the Tzura's entire desire is to give life to the Chomer HaTachton, right? Because that's the tachlis. Nevertheless, in order to allow it to be present enough to give life to the Chomer HaTachton, it needs to remain ever connected to its source in order so that it has the capacity to give over to its Chomer. Meaning, without being makusher to its source, it can't transition or transmit anything below down to the outgrowth from it. And therefore the tzura of the lower world, which is the ikar chayas of the chomer of the lower world, as well as the koyach havuso, as well as the source of its upholding and its existence, by necessity, it needed to remain above and to sit there in the elevated space of concealment perpetually. Why? And it's from there, Kaviyachal, the mother goes back up, so to speak, to the grandparent in order to give to the child. Right? The parent needs to ascend back up to the level of the grandparents so as to ensure that they are perpetually prepared to give what they can to the child, so to speak, speaking in generational terms. And like we said, and then because the upper 9 spheros kavyachol of the tzura hatachton are makusher to the chomer ha'elyon, which is like the parents being directly connected to the generation that preceded them, that's all for the purpose so that the lowest part of the tzura hatachton, which is like the extending part of the parents, that's going to be there and available to give to the next level, to that chomer hatachton, which is going to be the next generation. Yeah? Just say there. And it's only through this kind of link in the chain, the chut ha-meshula shaloi b'mehera yanatek, right? This three-pronged or this three-runged chain that's rooted above, in the middle, and below. Above being the chomer of the elyon, below being the chomer of the tachton. It draws, and it's through this mekayim kol mitziyusa da chomer ba'olamai kol hazman hanigzar alav. It's only through the tzura of the tachton's continued connectivity to its source, which is the Chomer HaElyon, that the Tzura HaTachton has the capacity to give the vitality and sustenance necessary for the upkeep and the upholding of the Chomer HaTachton. And why is it then? So if the tzura of the tachton, which comes from the chomer ha'elyon, if the job of the parent is to ensure that the child kind of is capable of perpetuating itself in its space and in its rightful space, then why is it only the lowest part of the tzura ha'tachton that extends down to the chomer ha'tachton? And that which we see that it's only the lowest part of the tzura ha'elyon that extends itself, right? It's only that lowest part, the malchus of the elyon, so to speak, which is going to be the cause of the upholding of that form and matter in accordance with the way that it should be. Aval ikra de hatzura, but the 9 upper elevated spheros kavyachal of that tzura which ascend back above to their source, hu shayach rak lamala. In truth, those things still only bear a shame of the elyonim, right? The only element that takes on a shame of the tachton is the malchus of every level. Everything else, from keser down to yasoid, the first 9 spheros never fully take on the name or the application of the halachos of the lower world that they extend into. The real giloy takes place by the malchus, right? The malchus is the one that extends itself further down. It's the only one strong enough and capable enough to maintain its own self-identity throughout all of the transitions. And the reason malchus is able to is because it has no identifiable identity. It remains what it is no matter what. It's leis lemegame klum. The Leshem is a book of malchus in the end of the day, because the entirety of Kabbalah is a book of malchus. Everything is only malchus. That's all we're ever talking about. And so that's going to be the whole kunz of that which appears to be the lowest expression is really going to be the purpose for the entire unfolding process, rooted bechevyon oz kavyachol, in that impossible place of potential and possibility that exists in the infinite prior to expression, which the Arizal, when struggling, so to speak, to find language for it, refers to it in Shaar Membez of Eitz Chaim as malchus de ein sof kavyachol, meaning that's what it is, right? The only beginning of conversation begins with the notion of malchus, which is what we're seeing right here. It's the lowest part of the tzura hatachton that's extending itself downwards to the chomer hatachton, while all of the other chalakim of the tzura hatachton ascend back upwards to their source. V'hu mishum ki rak zeh levad hu sibas ta'chomer v'tzuras ha'roilav. Haval ikra da'tzura shayach rak lamala. But in truth, the rest of the tzura, other than its last part, it is rooted above v'sham hu makomo, and that is its place. Umispashetes umityachedes lamata al yedei haketzan hatachton shelo. But the upper parts perpetually remain unified and connected below through the lowest part of themselves. V'sho'eves lemala umashefes lamata tamid, and it runs and it draws back upwards and it extends back downwards perpetually. So over here we have the sho'eves lemala, which sounds like it's drawing above, but the nira li ditzarach loimar melamala. So we're not getting into the tikkun soy from here, but melamala seems to be more of the proper reading of it, that it draws its strength from above and it draws that down perpetually. Yeah? Just say there. Tambe. So the first reason that the tzura of the tachton, most of it has to return back up to its source, is because the only way that it can do its job, so to speak, which is being mashpia to the chomer tachton mitzada ketza tachton shabo, is only if it remains perpetually connected to its source. Because without the perpetual connection to its source, it's cut off. It's menatek kavyachol. The second reason. Ki ilu shahaya kol nimsa. This is so important. Ki ilu shahaya kol nimsa mufrad me makoyrei hein b'choymrei hein b'tzuraso. If there were an actual severing or separation between the chomer or the tzura from its source, meaning to say, basically what we just said, the reason the tzura can't be severed from its source is so that the chomer is not going to be severed from its source. So the guiding principle here is that something can't be severed from its source. And so the reason that it extends back up above is because it can't be severed from its source. But if lu yitzura, we can imagine something that was severed from its source, hanishaya mufrad kol tzura da hatachton gam came b'makoro, that even the upper part of the tzura hatachton extended down into the chomer hatachton, thereby negating the connection between the upper part of the tzura hatachton and the chomer ha'elyon. Things would perpetually remain in a state of as they are without any shifting or changing whatsoever. Because in truth, any shift or any change or any adjustment, as we're going to see, all of these definitions of the word change or fluctuation are going to be necessary, but any shifting that takes place is only because there has been some sort of inspiration towards that change from a cause that preceded it. Right? It is a process of cause and effect. Things do not operate outside of a system, right? They operate within a system, and therefore, from the basic understanding of the system, other than the tzimtzum and certain elements of how we relate to Bria, Yitzhira, and Asiya, we're not looking for the miraculous here. Meaning, the answer is obviously HaKadosh Baruch Hu could have been manhig the Welt in any way he wanted to, but that's not what Kabbalah is coming to teach. Kabbalah is coming to give the rules and the shapes of Seder Eshtalshalos, and like we said, any language of Mukhrach or Hechrich, Zok the Leshem and his beer on Eitz Chaim is only once the Arizal was Magala, that Lashon, because that was the Hasaga, that this is a Hechrich, right? But we're trying to ensure that there is a system here, and that the system does not negate the unity, and the unity does not negate the system, but rather it's a paradox of a system that is unified and a unity that is systematized. And so over here, so we have to hold on to the very real idea that there is a cause and effect, and there are laws here. And the first law is that if there is a shift, it needs to have come from something above it. Something has to have pushed that shift along. The lower levels, or really any level other than the essential level of Or Ein Sof, has no capacity to create anything Yesh Me'ayin, to create anything new. And a shift and a change in perspective, or a shift and a change in alignment, is something new. So all newness or all shift comes from something above it. And it's on a certain level compelling the process of change in that lower level. Okay, so there is a need for there to be a cause to any effect. That cause needs to be seen as something that is compelling the change to take place, right? So it's ascendant and it's a compelling of that change to take place, and by definition that means it's above it. So we're speaking in a hierarchical chain order here. And connecting, right, exactly. Exactly. All of these relationships, right, of higher and unified and causal, right, and demanding of a shift, all hints to the fact that the lower level is simply an extension of the higher level.
Is he going to get into the discussion mentioned in Nefesh HaChaim about how Adam feels here?
Avada, not as much, but we're going to see how that's always an underlying kind of theme here in the world of Malchus. We saw that especially in Shaar Aleph by Shir Hashirim and by the role of the Ratzon of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Mislabesh and Malchus Tatzilus, but he will speak about that. Absolutely. And this upper cause is perpetuating the change. And every compelling element, every compelling agent is rooted in a place above it. And Lu Yitzor, that there was any creation or any lower level that was completely severed and disconnected from its source above, there would be no change whatsoever taking place. It would be the self-same perpetually. But this is not the Ratzon that HaKadosh Baruch Hu had in existence. Here's where the Leshem is really going to be hinting to the sugya of Gvuros and the Leshem and perpetual movement. Right? We know that the Tachlis of the Bria is la'asos, is to shift, is to change, and not to stand sturdily in one way. And by definition, in order for that to happen, it needs to be connected above. Because in truth, if there was an actual separation between any existence from its root above, whether we're talking on the level of Chomer or whether we're talking on the level of Surah, well, that severing would level out the activities or the creations of God with the way that human beings create things. She'achar gemar ha'pu'ula ein loy shayches oid ha'poel klal ve'ena mekabeles mimenu loy tesefes v'loy garon v'hi mitzido al matzav echad tamid b'chol zman kimo. If we speak of an absolute severing between the source and the outgrowth, so then the creation of God, so to speak, or the activities of God are no different than the activities of man. Right? The activities of man are one that the poel creates a pu'ula, the poel can build a table, and once that table is built, as the Baal Tanya uses as the mashal in the beginning of Shaar Yichud V'Emunah, as the Maharal speaks out so much, when I build a table and the materials are there, beyond the quantum level of things, the table continues to exist, and it doesn't deviate from its existence. It stays as it is, whether or not the paya, whether or not the active engagement with its creation is present or not. It can disconnect itself and the pula is not going to suffer. And if we speak of a severing of something from its source, so then we're equating God's activities to the same way that God created something, and then he no longer maintains, so to speak, a fundamental and inherent unified connection to that thing, and that thing could, God forbid, continue to exist. It's a chel Hashem lagamri of the highest degree to equate God's activities with the activities of man. Ba'asher shakavnasi yisbarach shemo b'chol ha'metzias ha'elamis b'klal u'b'prat lo haya kavana b'hem la'ashirem ha'metzius shem ata, and because everything that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has created and the intentionality behind all of existence in its general principles as well as its particulars is not to remain as it is in its existence at this moment, and that they should just exist in the way that they exist right now. The Leshem system is one of perpetual evolution. Everything is evolving towards tikkun at every single level. The process of things is a descent from above to below. The lower one down goes, the more momentum the descent allows for the eventual ascent afterwards, right? We ascend back up to a place even higher that we descended from, but that's the entire process. There is never a time where it operates at the bottom. It is a descent down closer to the bottom, down to the very last possible point at which we feel that we're even distant from the bottom, and at that point it shifts and it's in a proper state of perpetual elevation. This klal over here, this second reason for the essential upkeep between the lower and the upper is the gushpanka, so to speak, of the Leshem system. Things are perpetually changing because that's the tachlis. There has to be hischadshus and tikkun and birurim ad aliyas hakol chazara ad ein sof, and what the Leshem refers to as seder haklilus, soid haklilus, and soid ha'achdus, the process of integration, the secret of integration, and the secret of unity, which we're going to see in Deah. So that's the second reason, right? So the first reason is that nothing can exist without an inherent connection to its source, and the reason for the inherent connection of the tzura to its source is to give life to the Chomer HaTachton. The second reason is because if there was an actual severing from the tzura HaTachton from the Chomer HaElyon, that would imply a certain type of action that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is engaged in, which would be no different than human action, which would be devoid of any actual change, and things would remain static in their static kind of dead nature. Ulachain, and for this reason, Sider as binyan. It's for this reason that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has arranged the binyan kol hametzias, the architecture, the building of all of existence. Hein b'chlal, hein b'prat, sheyeh kol koyach kiyuma v'chiyusa, shekol echad kasher v'tali la'olam rak lamala. That everything in existence, whether it's the general principles or whether it's the particular, each and every ounce of energy and its power and its upholding and its vitality of each and everything is connected and dependent perpetually upon that which preceded it above. And all of the worlds in ascending and descending order are all unified and connected and dependent upon one another. Above, above, to the point that we come elav atzmo kavyachol yisbarach shemo. Umushgachim kulam tamid rak mimenu umenhagim kulam tamid rak al yado. And because of this linked chain process, everything is perpetually under the governance and the supervision of Him. May His name be blessed. HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'chvayda uva atzmo kavyachol. The hashgacha is always there, as well as the perpetual upkeep and governance is perpetually only through the hands of HaKadosh Baruch Hu Kavyachol. Ki shayavim kol chiyusam v'kol kayach kiyumim tamid rak mimenu levad. Because every level is simply drawing its sustenance and its upholding perpetually from that which ascends above it, and in ascendant gradations of that which is ascendant above, it's all tali v'omed on the one thing that is constant and the one thing that is stable and absolute, which is the light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. V'rak hu levad chai ha'olamim kulam, and this is why HaKadosh Baruch Hu is referred to as chai ha'olamim, the life of all worlds, which Leshem points out in the name of the Concordancia. He quotes the Concordancia, and it's in Deya Aleph, in Deya Beis, where he points out the value of this shame being used. It's a shame that's only used once theoretically in Tanakh, I believe, to identify HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and it's speaking of the loftiest awareness that each and every rung in the unfolding chain and order of things are all perpetually identified as being inherently connected always, without any deviation, to the light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu Kavyachol in every level. Chai Olamim. Chai Olamim. It's also connected to Yesod, because Yesod is the central pillar that descends from the lowest point up to the highest point, Ad Va'ad Bechlal. It goes all the way up to Orient Sof. All the way up to Orient Sof. Ravitch Meyer Shlita has a very extensive treatment of this very question in the Hakdama that he wrote to the Svarim of his Talmud, Rav Shmuel Ehrenfeld, on the Rashash. It's this Haskama kind of describes all the places that we see Yesod is Mamish Oila Ad Ein Sof Kavyachol. V'hinehu payal b'hem tamid. V'hinehu payal tamid b'hem. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu is perpetually engaged with every level of the chain. And it's for this reason that we see that all of existence is in a perpetual state of flux and change, and things do not remain constant, and there's no constancy to things, even for one moment of time. But rather, everything is perpetually shifting, perpetually. Again, these words perpetually mean to say that it's never not, meaning it's not that it happens a lot, it's not that it happens from time to time. This is the Metzias. It is never not, always already perpetually in a state of fluctuation. Right? And there's no menucha to them. Ela shehi bepu'ula tamid. Everything is in a perpetual state of action, of expression. And this is what the pasuk means when it says that God created the world to do, la'asos, for things to perpetually be engaged. Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu is perpetually engaged in existence at every moment. And any action, and any shift, and any change that takes place in the entirety of existence and creation in each and every moment is only coming from Him, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The same way that every activity of the guf is only emergence from the neshama. Over here, the neshama is going to be what? It's going to be the chomer ha'elyon, and the guf is going to be the tzura ha'tachton, right? And therefore, the guf, which is the tzura ha'tachton, is perpetually being upheld by the neshama, which is the chomer ha'elyon, which is why it has to be connected above so that it can change. And this is what is happening perpetually at every moment in existence through the Kadosh Baruch Hu's Hanhaga, al pi hakavana hatachlitit sheba. that is always and perpetually rooted in the teleological ends and the purposeful ends that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is directing all of existence at every moment. V'ayin devar mamukim bazeh b'devreinu b'sefer Hadayah chelik beis drush beis shem chadek aleph drush aleph siman gimel ois gimel. Yeah?
You're going at length in this second time.
Yeah, because this is where you see the Leshem. I'm going to use the Leshem. He can't control himself, so to speak, because he's not writing. He's being written, and so when it comes to certain inyanim, you see, and in Hakadosh, this is very sober of the Leshem, right? The Leshem could go on for pages, and then in the end he'll say, "Hashem Yisparach Yechaper Ba'adi." May Hashem kind of like, because I can't even say these things, but over here he is. You see that and you see where, for lack of a better term, we're not calling the Leshem a chassid here. Everything operates in the universe of the Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh and the Yechidei HaDoros. But the Leshem was not a chassid, right? It was the Hanhaga that it had to be that way. But here's where you see the or that's kind of mitpotzeis from the daf that kind of makes you feel exactly what he's saying. Water. Thank you, Tzad.
It just occurred to me, you mentioned several minutes ago about how the purpose of Tzura is really to help Chomer. That independently, it's really there to service. Yeah, you said that a while ago. Right, so neshama on its own really doesn't need anything.
No, yeah.
The whole purpose of neshama is to come down to this world.
Exactly. It's a great sushtal, right? That the entire tachlis of Bria is for the neshama to enter into guf.
I think the Ramban talks about that.
Thank you so much.
Even the whole idea of Olam Haba, that it can't just be a metaphysical type of existence.
Right.
It has to be
real. Beseder. V'neinasa kol zeh. How does this take place? How does this all take place? This perpetual upkeep that comes about from the source of the infinite itself, or the infinite source itself, rather. V'neinasa kol zeh ayidei hanefesh v'atzura shel kol metzias. The way that this perpetual upkeep takes place is that every chomer is connected to a tzura, and it's the tzura of existence that is perpetually ensuring the connectivity to the essential tzura kaviyachol, which is tzura olamim, right? HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Shehu hakoyach techolis havas v'tchunasa, that the tzura is the source of all of the emergence into existence, its upkeep and its nature. Hine oimed ikra rak lamad v'kshula la'ela la'ela adamatzil elion isparach shemo. That it remains perpetually connected above la'ela, like we said, and if it's connected one rung above, it's connected all the way up above to the matzil ha'elion isparach shemo. And it's only through the Hanhaga Ha'elyon of the Matzil Elyon Isparach Shemo that the engagement of the ascent or the descent is going to be taking place. Because there's going to be certain times where the nature of this particular chomer is going to experience a profound ascension and elevation. And there's going to be other times where it descends down from its level into a state of degradation from its original value, whether it might be a lot or a little. And so too this takes place and goes over each and every existence, meaning each and every one of us as well. We all go through changes, right? That a person is always in a perpetual state of becoming, of shifting, of changing. And all of it, every ounce of it, is rooted in the elevated providence and governance of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Kulam aman higupoyel es kulam, right? And it remains perpetually receiving that which is decreed upon it from the activities and the shifts that take place through the elevated surah, which is the power of its creativity and its upholding, both in its quality and its upkeep in the way that it remains connected above, davik b'sharasho, connected to its source, ha'elyon, v'kasher la'ela la'ela, and tied up above ad tzur kol olamim, to the tzur of all the olamis, which is the tzur kol olamim, the place of all the worlds, the artist of all the worlds, hamanigu paylas kulam, that is engaged in the upholding and the perpetual governance of all of them, v'hu yisparach v'yas'al shemay machlifaysim meshanu payalahem l'fi yatzarech l'tikunam l'chavanos tachlisam k'meish yispar b'samach. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu, may His name be elevated, right, is the one who's changing all of them, and the Meshane Itim, as we say in the Bracha and Mariv soon, Bezras Hashem, that Machlif as Azmanim, right, and it's Lifiat Tzarech Tikunam, and everything, every single shift, every single change, no matter how infinitesimal or infinite it appears, is all for the essential purpose of how it's going to be elevated, and the essential purpose and intention of all things, which will be described above. Tam HaGimel. So now we will go to the third reason that the surah has to be connected above. Tam HaGimel is as follows. V'hu karav l'tam beis. Because the purpose and the desire of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in this world is to create multiplicity, teeming amounts of creations without limit, the perpetual propulsion and perpetuation of particulars. Lahachlif aleim kol hashinuyim harabim v'ha'atzumim asher over aleim b'chol meshach zman matziv madrigasim atachtoina shiasa behem misayda machshav elyona, to ensure that each and every one of them undergoes each and every one of the shifts and the changes and the profound shifts and changes that go above them and take place through them throughout the time of their existence at that particular level, as HaKadosh Baruch Hu has arranged it in the secret of the ascendant thought of creation, of Kach Allah b'machshava. Ba'al yedei kol oisem hashinuyim ha'atzumim ha'mischalfim aleim tamid b'gzeres neira alilos Hashem meifolos b'shamayim v'aretz b'chol tzavyoinam. And it is only through all of these shifts and changes and existential quandaries and somersaults that are perpetually going on in a person, through a person, as the result of the decree of Noira Alila, of the wondrous ascendant way that HaKadosh Baruch Hu engages with us, that it perplexes the mind, Mifalus Shamayim Va'aretz, that I have no idea the Noira Alila of the creator of the Eretz and Shamayim and all of its expression, Hina Aidezem Mizdachech Chumriusam V'Nesksharim U'Mizachtim Kol Pratei HaMitziut Kulam Zebazeh V'Zebazeh Kulam Be'adam Shu Mivchar Kol HaYatzur V'Aidezeh Mitzalim Me'madrega L'madrega V'Yituknu Kulam Ayideh Adam. The third and final reason is that yes, the shifts and the change. The first reason, something has to remain connected above to its source. Okay, in order to attach itself to its source of power. The reason something has to attach itself to its source of power is because only by being attached to a source of power can things change. That's the second reason. Third reason is, why is it that things have to change? The reason that things change is that the change and the multiplicity and the proliferation of details, which appears to be a deviation away from unity, is for the very sake of the process of revealing unity, of the refinement of all of these particular details and changes that take place. This is the third and final reason for all of these perpetual shifts and changes, right? He's saying all of this, all of these changes, they refine themselves from their physicality, from their thickness, and they have the ability to unify themselves and to connect themselves. All of the particularities of reality, one with the other, the kulam be'adam, and then all of them attach themselves to the individual themselves. To the individual, like you hinted to in Shaar Aleph of Nefesh HaChaim, right? That the Adam themselves is the one who is at the ready to stand to receive and engage with all of these changes and all of these shifts. And the Adam is the Mivchar Kol HaYatzor, meaning the Adam is just the most spitz of changing things that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has created. That this process and this descent into the particularity of things, which means the descent into the confusion and the admixture of things, is all there so that the Adam themselves can be the one to untangle things and to refine things and to take the changes and see how all of the changes emerge from the singular unchanging root of all of things. Shebotali tikin hakoil, that it's the person where everything depends upon. La'alois imoy lamala lamakoyrim harisham asher lukhamisham, to elevate everything back up to the source that it was back in, to take physical matter and to refine it back into a level of vegetation, and vegetation back to a level of the animal, and the animal back to the level of speaking human, and speaking human back to the level of Yid, and Yid back to the level of Malach, and from Olam HaAsiyah to Yetzirah to Bria to Malchus to Atzilus, back to Atzilus, back to the Pnimius of the Partsufim, up to Adam Kadmon, to be Megala more or, to draw back more or and more Giloi. And all of this is for the purpose, the descent is only for the purpose of allowing these things to refine themselves through their own activity, or directly through the activity of the human being, that will allow them to ascend back upwards, to be satisfied from the pleasantness of the illumination of the ascendant satisfaction, the light of the face of the King, the living King, but ein soif v'tachlis. U'kamay shebiarnu ba'arucha kol zeh b'sefer HaKlalim klal tesvav v'yud zayin. Klal yud zayin in Sefer HaKlalim, which is built fundamentally on what we're seeing in Shaar Beis, about this Pashtas Rishon, Estalkus Rishon, this Pashtas Sheni, Estalkus Sheni, and the Yud, the K, the Vav, the K, Shaar Yud Zayin. I heard from Rebbe Kiva Erlinger Shlita, one of the Talmidim Mufhakim of the Rebbe, Rav Itchemeyer. His father was the Birchas Avram. That Klal Yud Zayin is the deepest place in the Leshem. So it's this idea. He's touching upon Mamish Kodesh HaKadoshim here.
This multiplicity, is it an account of each Slav of the Yishtal, or is it that when I first heard multiplicity, I was thinking in this Olam that I inhabit, there's a multiplicity of Briut, of different creatures and things and whatnot. So what I'm asking is it how it comes down into the world that I am in?
It's both. Quantitatively, things are perpetually equal, right? And Yitzir, you have riboy kitot of malachim and malachim pnimi and malachim yitzayim. In Bria, you have hechalos, meaning whatever the metaphor is of spatial coordinates and multiplicity, the multiplicity is the system, it's the shape of things. The thickness of the multiplicity and the levels of concealment that the multiplicity perpetuates is bevadai. This is the tacht sheyesh. But at a certain point, the multiplicity exists, but at a certain point it goes back into unity. But for now, prior to that, the avodah is going to be drawing the unity into multiplicity to reveal the unity within multiplicity. Right? That makes sense? Yes. The refinement, meaning when a person eats food, right? An animal is shechted. The shrita itself is already a progress of ascension, right? Again, the mitzvos and the kavanos of the Ari, once you have Eitz Chaim, the Ari of Chaim Vital writes that the tachlis of Eitz Chaim is pre Eitz Chaim. Meaning the Arizal called it Eitz Chaim and pre Eitz Chaim. What's the ikr? The pre. Because the pre is the application, right? That when I am engaged in eating, and I'm thinking about what the Ari writes about shchita, right? Or eating, or kavanas ha'achila, that is the zichuch. When I make a bracha, when I have kavana, when I eat properly, when I have the proper intentionality, when it's bekashrus haroi, and whatever, when it's eaten mindfully, meaning that's the zichuch habriya on every level, right? Or using animals to write books, right? However, it's being mezachech every second. And also the unfolding of it is the zichuch also, meaning it's the emergence of the dross, of the thickness that exists in these things that allows them to become symptoms later on, right? The energies, so to speak, that thicken into symptoms, right? The emergence of that energy, so to speak, into a thickened symptom is the process of its unfolding, which allows it to at least express itself, without which it can never be fixed. So it's the unfolding is also latachlis hatikun, right? But then it's so it's the unfolding expression and the zichuch and the refinement of it. So I can go tangential on all of this. I wanna see if we can maybe finish up Shaar Beis tonight, Be'ezras Hashem. You guys with me? V'chol hatikun v'ha'ilui hazeh hinei rak al yedei tzurasam asher nishar ikr m'lamala. And the only way that this ascent of all the multiplicity and the changes that take place is only because the tzura remains above in its essential form and connected to its source. And then once you access the highway of Tzura, so to speak, then you have a direct line of a blockchain, so to speak, a blockchain authentication of each surah being rooted in a surah above it, down to the point of authentication of being surah elam kaviyachol. Them kshurim v'tliyim zebazeh ad la'ela k'nizkar v'sham b'makoyrim hinem es achtim surah es kolam mitzius kulam ba'achtis gemura, and there in the source all of these forms of existence are unified in absolute unity, mishum shakulam nimshachu mimakor echad, because in truth they all emerge from a singular source. And as a result of their essential unification above, therefore they're connected down below. So here the Leshem is completely shifting the cause and effect process here, right? We just saw that once we unify them, them all down below, we can bring them all back to their source, but now the Leshem is hinting to the fact that the only ability you have to unify them down below is because they're always unified, because they're coming from the essential source. So how is it? So in truth, in potential form, things are always perpetually unified, but in appearance, they appear disunified. Our job is to refine the appearance of it, transform that disunity into unity, to reveal retroactively that things have always been unified. How do we see this interconnectivity? We see it by the nature of things are dependent upon one another in existence. They're species, yes, but each species to a certain degree is dependent on one another. Each one needs the other. And each one is helped along by the other. And all of them are dependent upon one another, and all of them are then revealed and utilized by the Adam. And all of them are going to be used by the Adam as well, right? It's like the circle of life, so to speak. But they also have the ability to be refined and elevated through the individual themselves. And all of this is only possible, their maintenance of that unity is only possible because it remains connected to the source above. And it's this tzura that remains connected to the Chomer HaElyon, which remains connected to its Chomer HaElyon and its tzura. Ad Ein Sof Kavyachol, that is the driving force behind all of the changes. Klal Gadol, that there's no Hamshachas HaMoichin, there's no Mosif HaMoichin, there's nothing new that takes place in existence that does not come directly from the Koyach of Or Ein Sof Kavyachol. No parts of, no matter how high it might be, you could talk about Reishad Lo Esyad, the Atik Yoimin of Reishad Lo Esyad, that none of them have a capacity, a kihuzeh of any expression other than the vitality of the divine light that HaKadosh Baruch Hu expresses within them at every second. There is no shinoi and no hosafa that doesn't come directly expressed by the source of all things. Ad shlebasoif machziro elav. Until the end, after all of the shinuyim and the pu'ulos v'tikunim shanasabo, in the end it returns back to its source. We see this shebesoif kol davar shechoyzer liyasodo. We see this with inanimate objects, that things return back to their organic state. They return back to the most simplified form of things. They reduce themselves down to the reducible kernel of where they come from. And things in the end of the day revert back to from whence they came. Right? And all of them are going to ascend upwards to the perfect unity of their purpose and the intention of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the creation of the world, as we're going to describe in Sefer HaKlalim. Hari lanu al kol panim. Al kol panim is going to be a key word. It's going to be these three letters, ayin, kuf, chup, shik, pei, that the Leshem also always uses to summarize. After I've expressed all of these myriad details to you, the essential point remains as follows. Hari al kol panim, ma sha'anu royim b'seder kol mitzvah sha'olam hazeh ki nizdar kol echad michayim v'tzura. What it turns out, what we see in this world, that each and everything is comprised of two forms, a chomer and a tzura, which is a guf and a neshama, or a kli and an or, as we're going to see. Right? These synonyms are very important. We have to be able to move from one language to another. Anytime I see the language of Kli, I also have to assume we're talking about the language of Chomer. Anytime I see the word Chomer, I have to assume I'm talking about a Guf, I'm talking about a Shem Ban in relationship to a Shem Men, I'm talking about Bria Yitzira Nasiya in relationship to Atzilas, I'm talking about Gvuros in relationship to Chasadim. These are key words that orient oneself to the fact that everything is really just saying the same thing. They're just different terms of application. Everything is composed of chitzonius, and pnimius says over here, and we also see that the external nature of things are directed by the inner intentionality or the inner light of things. Also pnimius, and that pnimius, that surah of the tachton, which is the or and the neshama, ikra lamala, is really connected to the source that it emerged from. And of that surah tachton, which comes from the Chomer HaElyon, in truth it's only the lowest rung of the Tzura HaElyon that remains connected to and extending downwards into the guf of the guf or the Chomer HaTachton, in order to serve as the neshama within it. And it's specifically through that lower rung of the Tzura HaTachton that remains connected to the Chomer HaTachton. And it's only through that interconnected point with the Malchus of the Tzura HaTachton that allows me to reach upwards to the source of all things and to perpetually be drawing my chayus, my vitality, and the strength of my upkeep from above in every moment of my existence. Also haneshama, and that neshama, that surah that gives life, shuat surah ha'ikris metzias asher omed lamala, that is the surah of each lower world that is connected in truth to the upper world. Hinu payal b'hametzias tamid, it is perpetually engaged with existence. Ve'eno manicha rega achas b'lei pula, and it's not allowing existence, the Chomer HaTachton, to sit with even one moment of rest without activity. V'chol pu'ulosa bahu kedei letakin chomrioseh, and all of its engagement. Right here we're seeing all three reasons. First reason is that it has to be connected to its source. Second reason is that it needs to change. Third reason, as we're going to see, it remains connected is in order to refine its physicality, lamata, that exists below, the purpose of all things is to ascend back upwards, to remain perpetually ascendant and unified with its upper source. Because before the Chomer of existence descended below, it also existed fully contained in its potential stage of the Tzura above it. But like we said, its containment within the Tzura was only in a state of potential. It hasn't been revealed in actuality yet. The only way, and the only reason for the emergence of all things is so that we can now show how all of the pratim and all of the changes are in truth rooted in the tzura. It was always rooted in the tzura b'koach, but it wasn't clear to us. The emergence of all the particularities and the ascent of the particularities back into the general principle is the revelation that all distinction is also part and parcel of unity. That's all tachlis of it. To be megalik kvod shemayim more. And after they've gone through this process, after things have been refined, it ascends back upwards in order to be refined, in order to partake and experience the purpose of its existence, which is the reason for its existence, which is to elevate it back up, one rung after the other, back up to the infinite itself, so to speak. Because it is a profound and ascendant thing for the neshama to refine the body below it. Because the entire purpose of the neshama's descent down is to refine the body. That's the only reason it's been created. That the guf, the lowest part, should be refined through the neshama. And it's also an extension and an expansion and an elevation of the neshama itself. This is the purpose that it came down here, to refine and help the lower levels elevate themselves back up. Oilim shnehem be'iloy rav lesanig lesadin b'or pnei panav atzmeis bar shemoy lesdavik lesyachid b'or kedushasa b'tachlis tikun ha'achron kavnosis bar shemoy b'chol briosoi oilamo devarim mamish neflaim. Now what has been clarified for us, at least, kikol neshama v'tzura ikru lamala. Right, that every neshama and surah of the lower world really belongs above. And it's only the lowest rung, the malchus of the tzura tachton, that extends downwards into the chomer and the guf hatachton. And it's through this that all of the rectifications are performed. And memela, it's explained from our words, that in this type of causal relationship and the relative positioning of one world in relationship to its source, is that the lower world is just going to be considered like a bucket that's being lowered down in relationship to the source of a higher world. It's going to be considered as nothing. Because in truth, anything that's emerging right now below was always already contained in a potential form above. And in truth, any extension of it or return of it back upwards is all through the expression of the infinite light. Imkein hari nimsa shekol tachton legabe elyon inihu rak koyach v'ha'ara v'shefa mimenu levad. And therefore, each and every lower world is going to be considered just an extension and an illumination of the upper world, meaning to say the lower world is not it doesn't even have a name in relationship to the higher world. It only exists as something separate from the perspective of the lower world. The perspective of the higher world, it still always existed, nullified in all nullification, in a state of potential, like the ray of the sun prior to the emergence. That's what we mean when we say Das Elyon versus Das Tachton, as we're going to see. It never stands alone. It always stands completely dependent upon and saturated with and rooted in that which exists above it. Be'ezras Hashem, Hadron Allah, Shaar Beis of Leshem Shvei V'Chalema, Hukdamas U'Sha'arim V'Hadra Chalan. Be'ezras Hashem.